I thought I'd talk a little bit about, to begin the sort of origin story of the book. Um, I suppose it starts really in 1995 when I called Peter up and asked him if he would read the manuscript for my first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, thinking that because he was the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation professor at UVA, the successor to Merrill Peterson and the successor to Duma Malone, who had been very, very hostile to the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that he too would be hostile. And I was sending the manuscript around, trying to find people who I thought would be in opposition to what it was that I was arguing. It didn't seem to make very much sense to send it to people who I thought might agree with me. I wanted people to tell me where I was wrong. That's always the best way to proceed. You don't really need an amen corner. You don't learn from that when you just engage people who agree with you. So, to my surprise, he was not anything at all like Duma Malone or Merrill Peterson. He was a scholar who had interests beyond Jefferson, as you heard from some of the books that Jeff mentioned, and had a very independent mind about all of this. He had the title Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor, but he was, as he said at that time, and says now, on occasion, conflicted about Jefferson. And of course, there's a lot about which to be conflicted. And he felt that way, and so he read the book and was very supportive of what I said. And that began a friendship and a sort of collaboration without writing things down that has lasted from that time period on. We've talked a lot about Jefferson, we've argued about Jefferson, and fast forward to a few years ago, and he began to think about retiring, which nobody who was associated with him, his friends and other people wanted him to do, because we always wanted him around doing the same thing that he always did so that we could be a part of all of that. I thought that it would be a good idea if we actually put down some of the things that we had been thinking about, some of the things that we've been talking about. Also, I had in mind to do a biography of Jefferson. I focus more on slavery and politics and the early American Republic. He is an intellectual historian. He knows the politics and all these other things as well, but we both have different approaches to the area. The intellectual side of it, I mean, obviously race is a part of it, slavery was a part of it, but it's a different focus than the day-to-day plantation life, which is what I'm interested in and the things that I have focused on about life at Monticello among the people enslaved there. So we thought that this would be a good idea to have a collaboration where people who have approached Jefferson from different directions actually sat down and talked to one another about these matters. And that's how all of this got started. And we sat down, mapped out what it is that we wanted to do. There were some points of contention. Yes, there were. There were points of contention. You know, you gave up. No, you didn't give up on all of them. But points of contention, different, you know, the different approaches are great, but sometimes there are different approaches that can, in fact, clash. But we basically like each other, so we worked through all of those kinds of things, and we, you know, we got it together. We argued about a few things. One particular thing, Jefferson's attitude about religion, we quarreled about. He ended up convincing me that he was right about this, on this particular point. You prayed, and he was right about the particular point. I, as a, you know, culturally attend the United Methodist Church, and there's an idea about what a Christian is, and Jefferson is or was an unconventional Christian. That is why my home state, Texas, wanted to take him out of the history books, because he did not believe in the divinity of Christ, and they wanted to substitute John Calvin, that noted American, in the American history book for Jefferson because of his views about the separation of church and state, and because he was not a believer in the sense that people who are traditional type Christians believe. Jefferson is seen as a deist. Many people see him as an atheist, and he is sort of the patron saint of the sort of new atheists. My dear late and lamented friend Christopher Hitchens and I also used to argue about this. He believed Jefferson was an atheist. I tried to convince him that he wasn't. But I didn't think that Jefferson was a traditional Christian, and that when he says, I'm a Christian, that I was saying, well, he's just saying that to kind of get along with people in the neighborhood. He convinced me that that's not true, and I had to come to the realization that I was being a bit prejudiced on my part for thinking that Christianity had to be one thing, and the kind of thing that the tradition in which I was raised and understandings. So those kinds of things, that was probably the sharpest conflict we had. The rest of it worked pretty well, but I'm going to let him tell you now what we hoped. Well, he can tell you what he wants, but I'm hoping he will tell you what he thinks we achieved here and what we're trying to achieve here and why we think it's important.
Right. So, why another book about Jefferson? I had resisted the idea of writing about Jefferson. A trade publisher came to me once and said, would you do it? You make big bucks. And I said, I think that's really a boring idea. It took an invitation from Annette to convince me that maybe we could offer something fresh. I think both of us felt that we had been pushing the frontiers, this sounds really arrogant, of Jefferson scholarship, so that what we did together is what we could not do separately and what nobody had ever done before. Now, those are big promises, and if you go buy the book right now, I will tell you what no, I'm just joking. It's just, she reminds me that this is book promotion time. But what is the big payoff? I think it comes down to our title, which is chosen with great care, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. And it's a bit jarring to hear that, isn't it? Because Thomas Jefferson was voted most popular dead president in Missouri in 1885 because, obviously, because he was a Democrat, probably a big D Democrat, Jeff, as well as a little d Democrat. The kind of merging of Jefferson with the Declaration, with the tradition of democracy, that's been the ticket for Thomas Jefferson until the modern era when slavery and race got in the way. He had his ups and downs, and my predecessor, Merrill Peterson, wrote a wonderful book called The Jefferson Image in the American Mind, which suggests that Jefferson is a very interesting canary in the American mind shaft, and you can find out a lot about who we are by what we think about him. One of the reasons I think we can't get rid of him and don't want to get rid of him is that he tells us about ourselves. Well, enough of that. I want to tell you how we hope to break out of this master narrative about the master of Monticello and say something that would interest us. That's the challenge, I think, for all scholars. Can you keep yourselves interested? And so here's what we wanted to do with that title. This is a quotation from Jefferson. This is what he said to Angelica Schuyler Church, Hamilton's sister-in-law, in a letter in which he's thinking about life at home. He's licking his wounds largely inflicted by Angelica's brother-in-law, and he wants to go home, and he's telling her what he values. And what he values is his private life with his books, with his plantation, with his daughters, with his grandchildren. It was a beautiful, bucolic, pastoral image, but he uses the word most blessed of the patriarchs if, as his daughters reproduce and the family grows, you can imagine this fantasy of a great household over which he presides. And though he's a great Democrat in our estimation, that is the world's estimation, he was a man of his world. Patriarchy was a given. It didn't even have to be articulated. He didn't feel bad about saying it because, of course, he knew what was best. You've heard about father knowing best. He knew what was best for his household. And it's a household that included enslaved people. This is the nub of the challenge of our interpretation. Could we integrate Jefferson's slaveholding into his life? Not just a chapter says, now let's stop the story and think about Jefferson. He owned slaves. No, it has to be central to his life. Well, how do we integrate his slaveholding, his private life, his notion of benign or a blessed patriarchy into his career as the iconic figure in the history of American democracy? And this is what we want to offer. First of all, it requires disagreeing with our subject, with Thomas Jefferson, who spent a great deal of time, including this letter that is our title letter, telling himself and the world that there was a complete distinction between public life, the nastiness of having to deal out there in this dog-eat-dog world, or Hamilton-eat-Jefferson world, and his private life, where everything was light and reasonable, where everything moved in a clock-like fashion because he had a lot of clocks and he was into timeliness, where the music was sweet, where people would perform music together, where the sounds orchestrated a comforting environment. The private Jefferson. Many historians have described him as impenetrable. There's no way you can understand him. He protected himself from our gaze. Well, this is nonsense. That's the short version of our book, and now I'll sit down. Let me give you one instance of this, of what patriarchy means in a practical way. And I'm going to risk boring you a little bit if you don't care about politics and constitutionalism. And Annette's been very patient over the years. And I have to say, when I get my chance to say what this book is all about, and I don't want to sound too sentimental, but it's all about spending a lot of time with one of my best friends in the world, Annette Gordon-Reed, who's a wonderful human being. It's a great privilege for me to work with her. And we're really hoping for a lot of sales so that we can protract this tour. The tour that never ends. What a fantasy. I don't think she shares this vision of the future. Okay, I'm just going to try this out on you. Annette talked about the religion thing, and I was maybe going to tell you about how I've always been deeply conflicted about Jefferson, but I found myself, despite myself, and I always accused her of liking him too much, I found myself, when I wrote about the old guy, this is what they call in the business a pathetic fallacy, identifying with him. As an old man, there's a lot to be said for Jefferson. This is when his spiritual life, his effort to understand his place in the world and the flow of time, is at its most poignant and eloquent. And there is an image I have and developed of Jefferson that I think we share, of a man who held on to a faith in progress, a faith in the future of liberty that is quite touching, particularly because it was falsified at every moment if you would look beyond Monticello. But he turned in and he cultivated this sense. He prayed, and this was what we fought about. That's why I said I was praying. Jefferson tells people he's praying. What is he praying about? And it's a strange thing to imagine him praying. This is what got Annette so upset. I know prayer, and this is not prayer. But he would go into his sanctum sanctorum, into his private suite of rooms, where he wrote, where he read, and where he prayed. And what he prayed about, what he says he prays about, it's not just formal salutations, I pray for your well-being. He does that, as other people do. He instead prays that the younger generation will continue the good work. He prays, and it needed a lot of prayers for the Madison administration. And that's kind of beautiful, isn't it, Jeff? Because if the Madison administration doesn't succeed, that mighty wave of opinion that had swept across the land and brought the revolution back to America and knocked the Federalists out of their high perch promised a future of progress and enlightenment, but it's something you had to pray for. You couldn't take it for granted. Well, here's the little bit. I wasn't going to tell you that. That just happened. And this is what we trust, a benign nature's God. He's up there. In fact, no question it's a she. Is looking after our well-being. And this is it. Have you ever heard of the idea of the ward republic, the little republic? Let me fill you in on it. Jefferson thought that Virginia was basically rotten. There's a real streak of Virginia loathing and Pennsylvania envy and New England envy in Jefferson. You know, don't laugh at that last one about the Pennsylvania envy. And that is that that Massachusetts had something that Virginia didn't have. It had the thing that Alexis de Tocqueville noted in Democracy in America. It had town meetings. Isn't that the very essence and the foundation of a robust, participatory, strong democracy? Are we with Jefferson now? Virginia, where we have oligarchical county government of a kind of co-optative elites that keep appointing themselves, it's the epitome of corruption. And here, the Jefferson, they won't write a proper constitution. I have a plan for you, he says in his retirement, when he wants to provide not only for the University of Virginia, I promised a shout out on that one, which is going to educate a future generation of leaders, but he also has an idea that Virginians are finally ready to write a constitution which will guarantee the future of democracy. Now, I want you to be excited about all this, and then I'm going to let you down. And then you're going to read the book for therapy. Okay, you get excited because we have this idea of a great national republic that includes all the states. And as you may have heard, it's not written in the Declaration of Independence, but all states are created equal. That's the next level below the great national republic. We need that national republic because the United States, the American people, representing this force for enlightenment in the world, a beacon of liberty. But the states are where we live, and their self-government exercised at the state level brings it closer to the people. But we're not close enough yet, folks. Go down to the level of the county. Every county is created equal. And here's the secret. As we go down these levels, every level must respect the integrity of the level above and below. And if there's any interference in the liberty of the states and the freedom of the states, the rights of the states or of the counties, or that final level, the level of the ward, the township that didn't exist in Virginia. This is why it has to be newly constructed, this whole mechanism for government, multiple levels. And it is, and it inspires many strong democratic political theorists. It gets them all excited. But there is one final level. This is the letdown. There's one final level, he says in his letters in 1816. You go from the national republic to the state, to the county, to the town, and then you go to the plantation or the farm. The terminal level that ends with the planter and his plantation. And just as nobody knows what any state should do, but what it sees it should do, as Missouri, for instance, I shouldn't get into the Missouri controversy, has the right to determine its domestic institutions, that would be slavery. To maintain the institution of slavery, it's not Jefferson's fault, but that is the gift of the Missouri controversy, that Missouri would be a slave state. Jefferson was an anti-restrictionist. But we move down to the level of the planter in his plantation. Nobody knows better how to rule the plantation than the planter. He has absolute authority. The final term of this federalist scheme with a small f, this notion of democracy, majority rule operates at every level until we get down to the irreducible final level of the planter on his plantation, and we are now talking about democracy as Jefferson understands it as the defense of the institution of slavery. Nobody messes with the slaves on Jefferson's plantation, even though he knows it is an unjust He would agree with you, an evil institution, that evil must be rectified in the fullness of time. But right now, this is my domain. I am the patriarch. So I want to suggest in that notion of patriarch is not just father knows best, and of course somebody's got to take the heat and make the decisions and represent the family. It's also a notion of rule, or what we might call despotic rule, the rule of a slave-holding planter. Now, I hope you're thoroughly depressed, because up until that point, this was hooray for democracy, and yes, you did the right thing, Mizzou, to create that sacred space for Thomas Jefferson. Well, I don't know how we feel about that, but what I do feel is this, and that is that what we love in Jefferson, and what we properly love in Jefferson, a respect for the voice of the people manifest in these majorities at this different level. A national majority, what does that mean? You have to bring it down so that you feel a real identification, home and family. And home and family are at the core of our book. Home and family are the foundation of the Republic. But of course, what is good is also bad. You want Jefferson, you want democracy, you've got to look it in the face. It's all the things we love about ourselves, but all the things we also deny about ourselves. Now that sounds really profound and deep. I don't know if it's the kind of incentive that you need to buy this book. But there is one hope that will redeem this terrible performance, and that's the voice of my dear friend, Annette Gordon-Reed.
What can I say after that? What can I say after that? And it struck me, working on this book, how much faith he put in the notion of politics. Not really understanding economics. He had a terrible understanding of what was going to happen with the future of slavery. I mean, he had a plan. The idea was you have the Louisiana Purchase, you have land. It's easier for white people to emancipate blacks when blacks are in an extreme minority. You know, people talk about New England, people talk about other places where you have gradual emancipation. The key is that those are places, New England, where there are not that many blacks. So slavery was not just about people working for no pay, it was also about social control. Virginia is 40% African American during Jefferson's time. South Carolina, I mean, the ratios are, there are more blacks, it's a black majority. The issue has never been how white people respond when there are one or two blacks in a different place, or a small number. It's when there are large numbers of blacks moving into a country, moving to a neighborhood or whatever. And so his notion was to spread slaves out, enslave people out, and if they are in states in small numbers, then you could have emancipation. Of course, we know that that's not what's going to happen. You open up the territories to slavery. They start to grow sugarcane and cotton, and it becomes enormously profitable. Slave prices go up. But he's thinking primarily all the writing is about politics and republicanism and the Enlightenment, and how one of these days people are going to come to the realization that this is a backward system. But of course, it was not a backward system. It was not an economically backward system. It was a profitable system. So this person who's thinking about ward republics and about political relations with, people's relationships with one another, and that it's all about voting and about democracy in that way, had no real understanding about or thought about economics and how that played into it as well. And people notoriously compare him to Hamilton on that score, and other people who did sort of understand, not in terms of talking about slavery, but just basically understanding that economics are a big part of things as well. It's a very, very old-fashioned, we would say, understanding about politics and what politics can accomplish. Now, the book is about, we have a chapter called Politics, we have a chapter called Virginia, a chapter called Plantation, but we also have another section that talks about Jefferson, the private person, about music, about visitors and his sense of privacy, and then we end up talking about religion, which I think will interest a number of people, because as I said, there are the sort of a school of thought that sees him as an atheist. On the other hand, there's a now, I guess, a move to sort of turn him into an evangelical Christian. I guess David Barton, the book that had been withdrawn has been reissued. I think he's made corrections to it and so forth, and has presented it. This is sort of out with us now, a picture of Jefferson as an evangelical Christian, because people feel that you're shaking your head, Jeff, but yes.
He clipped the miracles out of the Bible.
What?
He clipped the miracles out
Yes, Jefferson very
With
famously,
evangelical zeal.
with evangelical zeal, took a razor and cut out all of the things that were miracles in the Bible, any things that he thought was supernatural, things that that Jesus never complained, that never said that he did, never claimed that he did, to have a secular Bible. And this was something that was given out to members of the House of Representatives up until
It was an Iowa Republican,
Yeah.
1907.
yeah, up until the
You guys haven't
1950s.
paid for this thing to be distributed.
Up into the 1950s, I believe, and you get a sense of how much this country has changed, where you could give out the Jefferson Bible devoid of miracles to members of the House of Representatives. That could never happen now. We sort of, this is another thing about this notion of progress and his sort of naive belief that things are going to get better and better and better, his belief that people were basically good. And that was a very different understanding about, that people would eventually come to a point where they would do the right thing, and you were constantly going forward. And here's a situation where, you could have given out that book years ago, but now it would be unthinkable to have something like that given to members of the House of Representatives. So we're not marching towards some inevitable moment when everything is going to be all right. And he actually believed that, and I think it was his faith in science, scientific advancement. He was interested in lots of things, inoculation, vaccination. He vaccinated, he was the person who vaccinated people in the area at Monticello, and was constantly trying to do that, get people in Albemarle to do that as well. So he's sort of seeing the world through the prism of science. Scientific advances were like political advances or like social advances. One day we will get better and better and better. And that's, certainly a debatable proposition. We go forward, 3 steps forward, maybe 4 steps back or whatever. And he didn't see that. He just saw this bright future. I mean, Ron Chernow, in his biography of Hamilton, has a chapter. His chapter on Jefferson is called Dr. Pangloss, to sort of describe what his attitude, that this was a person who just thought it'll all get better. And that, I think, makes it easy. The slavery question makes it easy to understand. One of the things that people keep asking us, how could he have talked and written so eloquently against slavery and remained a slaveholder himself, which people find difficult to understand. To me, people have a set of intellectual beliefs that we don't always live up to, and we can't bring ourselves to. There will be a time when people will look back and say, once New York is underwater, people will say, oh, what on earth were they doing? They knew that this was a problem, and yet there they were, tooling around in their cars and burning fossil fuels and whatever, not making a personal sacrifice. I think he intellectually had a set of beliefs that he did not have the emotional ability or the inclination to do anything about. Give up slavery. Most of the people who freed their slaves were people, in Virginia I should say, who were people who were under the influence of religion. And they were under either Quakers, Methodists were early people who suggested, who said that you could not be a slave owner and be within the church. Baptists for a time believed that. Now, as more upper class people came to these religions, they changed the view and said, oh, yes, you can. And so things split. But Jefferson was not under the influence of religion. So he didn't have that as a push. He didn't think that he was going to go to hell, which was something that motivated other people. So without that, what he ends up doing is trying to be what people would call, what people saw him as, a liberal. The person who says, I am a slave owner, but I'm going to do this the right way. Now, we laugh at that and say, well, of course, how can, there's no a benign, a benevolent slave owner? I mean, it's inherently an exploitative thing. How do you do this in the right way? And he thought that he could do it in the right way by, occasionally paying people, eschewing the whip as in sort of incentive as a way of getting people to do things. All these sort of personal things that, and we talk a lot about in the book about how the Hemings family, his closeness to the Hemings family, those are the people who are around him. They are the faces of himself. They are the faces of slavery for him. And they are people that he treats very differently than he does people down the mountain, with whom he doesn't have very much contact and would not have had much contact, did not really know in the same way. So if you imagine a person, I guess he would be called what people would call a limousine liberal, a person who has these set of beliefs, who sees himself as doing things benevolently, but really is not advancing things in any way. And I should also say, he was a person who really understood the people around him. We talked a little bit about this earlier this afternoon. He could not see that there would be a legislative solution to the problem of slavery. The Virginia legislature was not going to do away with slavery. And I think that was right. That was the right, correct judgment on his part. I mean, people had tried. He had submitted, through a friend, submitted a bill for emancipation. It didn't get anywhere. St. George Tucker, a Virginian in the mid-1790s, tried to submit a petition to end slavery in Virginia. They wouldn't even take the petition from him. Absolutely no quarter on that at all. And, I don't know what could have been done in Virginia. We were talking earlier this afternoon about you would like historical figures to do the things that we want them to do, to make the valiant fight, to go down in flames. Jefferson was obsessed with the American Revolution and his place in it and his ideas about the revolution. And as a politician, he understood that he would destroy his career and destroy himself. We wouldn't be talking about him if he had become like William Lloyd Garrison. If he were a sort of William Lloyd Garrison figure in the 1780s and the 1790s, talking about this, going on, writing pamphlets about it, doing these kinds of things, he was interested in being the president, being a person who influenced the development of the United States of America. We would like for him to have been obsessed about slavery or, against slavery, but that's not what, we created a country, the next generation of people, the next step is for you guys to do that. But I think he surmised that there was no way to have a legislative solution to slavery in Virginia, and slavery in Virginia ended the way we know it ended. And historians don't like to talk about inevitability, but I think it was highly unlikely that this was something that the Virginians or people of the South Carolinians would have given up just by voting in the matter. It had to be stopped by force in the way that it was stopped.
And that's a tragedy of democracy, because the sacred principle for Jefferson, the mother principle of republicanism, is majority rule. So do you impose an end to slavery against the will of the people? Well, how do you square that circle? How do you make a people come to the realization that slavery is an unjust institution? Well, you can teach them, you can do missionary work, as he recommended to Edward Coles, his young neighbor, but you have to be patient. You have to wait for the progress of enlightenment, a progress that was never going to happen. Annette suggested that he wasn't a good economist, and for all his training in the law and all the law writing, the study he did, He didn't understand this basic fact about legal regimes, and that is the creation of slave codes. Once you have a slave code, you have made human beings property. And you know how we feel about property in America. Missouri had 5% of the population was enslaved, I believe, at statehood. Not a lot of slaves. You say, well, there's a great situation for this diffusion idea of a few slaves. Well, they're not threatening to you. You can emancipate them. Well, that's predicated on the realization that you, or the faith, I should say, the prayer that they will reach that moment when they want to emancipate their slaves. Well, you know what happens in most slave regimes with slave codes? You can't even legally do it. That is sacred property. That might be, I think we'd agree with this. This is the absolute fatal, tragic flaw in the American conception of democracy and majority rule. You sympathize with Jefferson. We should see the light collectively. That's the Enlightenment project. But what if we don't? How about a war?